My name is Abby, and I'm a workaholic, but I work for God, so I try to justify it. Maybe I'm not the only one in this room willing to admit that today, or willing to admit that we have trouble with that work-life balance. Our society not only tolerates working all the time, but it rewards it, and it glorifies it. This new status symbols all around are exhaustion, fatigue, overscheduling, overworking, overcommitting ourselves. And it's doing damage to our mind, body, and soul. A Forbes article in January of this past year named that 55% of all paid time off went unused. And women often take less PTO than men. U.S. employees are actually receiving more PTO, but are using less of it. 48 million Americans left the workforce in 2022 as part of the Great Resignation. And 72% of Americans currently say that their job is making them experience burnout. So all of us in this room experience a form of work, whether you're paid or not, whether you volunteer, whether you are a stay-at-home parent, all of us have work to do. And when we do work, it is the hope that we do it to the glory of God. We do it in such a way that we are working from our passions, our heart center, so that we find these healthy rhythms of life, work, and play. So, I find it pretty comical that I am the one giving this sermon because I've spent most of this past month off. Last Sunday was my first full week back, leading into my first full week since the end of September. And so I bet you're wondering, what does somebody, especially a pastor, do when they have a whole month off? I ended up walking 76.22 miles to attend church. So I walked the Camino de Santiago, which is a pilgrimage pathway, a network through northern Spain. And so this pilgrimage route, via tradition and legend, say that St. James, the disciple James, ended up, after Jesus' death and resurrection, Jesus commanded the disciples to go share this good news to the ends of the earth. And at that point, Spain is the edge of the world. And so James supposedly went into Spain to share the good news. And then later he was martyred for our faith and was beheaded. And so his body was taken back to Spain and buried in a field that was then, a cathedral was built on it to venerate his bones. And so now for centuries, people have walked this pilgrimage to pay their respects, but also just the walking portion allows you to slow down, to get away from all of the work and expectations of home, to really find times to connect with themselves, with God, and to center their vocation. And so I want you to take a look at a little bit of my travels here. So during the day, our group of 20 would split off. We would walk our own pace until the very end of the day. We had a translator, Carlota, with us that would organize us at the beginning and end. And one of the first days, we ended up spending most of the afternoon walking together. And I asked her, how did you get this really awesome job of getting to be a tour guide in Spain? And she's local to Spain. But she shared with me that right out of university, she started working for this company, and she was doing really great, making tons of money, but she had no margin in her life for friends and family. And her older brother was doing all of this traveling, and she got jealous of him. And so she decided to take a sabbatical from her job. And because she was such an important person in this company, they were willing to hold her job for 5 years. And so she went to go travel, and shortly into this sabbatical, she knew that she didn't want to return. And so she told him, no, thank you. And so she ended up selling most of her possessions and moved into a van to travel. And so she was able to save up more money this way and really get to do what her heart's desire was. And so she shared that then ultimately she got this travel guide job and now gets to walk people on the Camino and different places like that. And so that she now saves up just enough money for a time period and for different travels that she wants to do. And then she spends weeks and months away from work so that she can do what she wants to do. And so she reminded me that life is too short to work all the time. And so that's going to be our focus today. And so my time away, I had an amazing time, but when I came back from Spain, I had some pretty battered feet, blistered and swollen, and so I came back and did nothing for a week, which is kind of crazy for my life normally. So I spent time reading because I felt like I still needed to be productive, and I love to read. And so I pulled a book off my shelf that I've been meaning to read for a while, and it hit me right where I needed to because it had a lot of intentional pieces that go along with this sermon. So this book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer, has some wonderful understandings about what's going on in our world today. One of those being hurry sickness. Hurry sickness is a continuous struggle, an unremitting attempt to accomplish or achieve more and more things or participate in more and more events in less and less time. And that was a phrase coined by a cardiologist because this cardiologist realized that it was having an impact on people's hearts and their well-being. And so you might be familiar with some of the symptoms: irritability, hypersensitivity, workaholism, restlessness, emotional numbness, out of order priorities, isolation, lack of care for your body, escapist behaviors, and slippage of spiritual practices. Maybe you, like me, have checked off a number of those symptoms in your life. I know that I caught that sickness myself. In July of 2020, I took over the leadership of our Raytown campus, and it was my first ministry job of caring for an entire community, a church community. And it so happened to be during a global pandemic, and that is something that they don't teach you in seminary. I was in seminary, a full-time student at the time, and early in my leadership, I had to navigate whether we were going to close the doors officially or do something completely different to relaunch the relaunch. And so, again, I was a full-time grad student and was only supposed to be working part-time at the church. And but the needs for adaptation during the pandemic and trying to figure out what to do just took way more than what part-time could offer. So I worked and worked and worked to a point of burnout. So I finally convinced myself to take at least a day away. So I went to Perry, Kansas, to this little tiny house and spent overnight in the woods with no electricity, no contact to anybody. And underneath the staircase leading up to the loft in this tiny house is this art piece. It had a circle and 4 lines jetting off and then 4 words: take, break, bless, give. And if you know our communion liturgy that we do, those are the 4 actions that Jesus did at the Last Supper, and that what we do in our communion ritual. And so By that point, we had already started serving a couple hundred to-go meals in our parking lot every first and third Wednesday. So this art piece seemed like it was like a sign. And so I kind of started to wonder, is there more to these meals than we're thinking? So when I came back enlightened, from being away, and shared with our leadership, hey, I think it would be a really great idea to stop our Sunday service because it's not thriving and completely transition to a dinner church where we gather around a table and celebrate communion, that we have conversational preaching about life and faith. And so they took me up on this radical idea, and the pandemic, though, continued to put this vision on hold for some more time. I worked endlessly to bring a team of people together to support this vision, and when we were ready, we could fully go into it. I continued to function in survival mode. Due to stress and anxiety, some of the first things to go was sleeping, then my set-aside time for devotionals and journaling. Weekends were few and far between when I didn't have schoolwork or church work beckoning. There was little time for friends or family because I had no energy left to invest in them. And the pivotal moment was, I remember the day when I took a Post-it note and I wrote myself, "It's okay to rest today." I was in such a frantic survival state that I had to write myself a permission slip to rest. My ego kept telling me things like, the church is too fragile for you to step away. It's going to fail if you are gone for too long. You've always been an A student, so you can't ask for an extension on this paper or skip that assignment. And so I stand up here today to confess that I have modeled poorly the way of Jesus and the rhythms and life of Jesus in my work and in our community. Our faith has something to say about this hurry sickness and our relationship to work. And as always, Jesus is our example, our model for helping us to live different patterns and rhythms than that of our Western productivity culture says. I want you to hear these words of Jesus. "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." We know that Jesus lived on earth for about 30 years, his early 30s. And so he worked for about 3 years in ministry, which is crazy to think that we work so many years up into our 60s or 70s for retirement. Jesus was bivocational. He was a carpenter and a teacher, and so he likely would have crafted yokes, wood cross pieces that would go over a team of animals, most likely ox in this case. And so they would tailor these cross pieces perfectly to fit the backs of these animals, because if it rubbed them the wrong way, they wouldn't be very productive. They would be injured and wouldn't be able to continue their work. And so they were carefully adjusted to give them ease and no pain. So when Jesus says, "My yoke is easy," what he probably means is the life I give you is not a burden to you. It's been made to measure, to fit you perfectly. We know that the Orthodox Jews saw that the law was something that they maintained the rhythms of their daily life by. And so they would have seen this as endless things to keep up with. The Jews used the phrase "the yoke" to imply submission to something, and in their case, the law. And for them, they felt it could be burdensome to every area of their lives. But the yoke Jesus came to give was one of loving God and loving neighbor. And for us, that can seem like a burden, because this yoke challenges us to submit ourselves, to consider how we love God and our neighbor with how we work and how we live each day. Because when I put these verses in the context of work, I kind of want to have an argument with Jesus. Because I'm like, Jesus, do you know the modern standards that we have to live by in this country? Because the gospel of America says bigger and better houses, bigger cars, speedier cars, store up your treasures here, work more than what is required, climb that ladder. You must be involved in X, Y, Z for your happiness to be fulfilled. If we live by the world's standards, the yoke of Jesus seems like a burden. It seems heavy if we have to live in less square footage. It feels heavy to not participate in that or own that. It feels heavy to give to the poor. It feels heavy to take time away from work. It feels heavy to be a disciple in the 21st century because we're wearing an ill-fitted yoke, one of our Western productivity culture. But throughout Scripture, we see Jesus, again, models a different way and says, I have a different yoke for you to wear. So back to John Mark Comer's book, he outlines 5 different practices that we're going to go through this morning that I would like you to think about applying to your life. He points out that as we track Jesus' ministry of teaching and healing, that as he does more of that he spends more and more time in silence and solitude. He takes time away, and he invites his followers and us today to find times of silence and solitude. So we have 2 examples of this, many more, but after Jesus' baptism, he goes into a temple and declares, this is why I'm here, this is what I'm going to do, and then he spends 40 days in the wilderness. He works just 1 day and then spends 40 days off. Wouldn't that be a lovely work schedule, my friends? Right? And then afterwards, we find out that Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, is beheaded. And so Jesus, this family member, has died, and so Jesus takes time away to grieve. And so right before he leaves, though, some of the disciples come back and say, hey, like we've done all these wonderful things, and Jesus rejoices in that and says, hey, friends, come with me to this place of solitude and silence. He doesn't send them back out to do more work. He says, come with me away to pray and to be renewed. So again, we find out the busier Jesus gets, the more time he seeks solitude. But he didn't do that with ease because there was a crowd of people that followed them to that place of solitude. And so they were hungry, and so the disciples were like, send them away, send them away. And Jesus was like, there's a need here that's more important. And so he fulfilled it. And then he followed through with his intentions to find rest and silence. So sometimes there are needs that get in the way of our silence and solitude, but we return back to our intention. John Mark Comer says, for us, usually it's the exact opposite of what Jesus does. When we get over busy and life is hectic, the people who are vying for our time, the quiet place is the first thing to go rather than our first go-to. The first thing we lose is unhurried time to just sit with God in the quiet, to pray, read a psalm, take an internal inventory, let our souls catch up with our bodies. Solitude is when we set aside time to feed and nourish our souls. One way to allow our souls to catch up with our bodies is to practice Sabbath. That's another practice I want you to think about. So Sabbath is, in Hebrew, Shabbat, to cease or to stop. And so this originates in the creation narrative. When God created the universe for 6 days, afterwards took a 7th day to completely stop and was delighted in all of the universe and creation. And God then told our ancestors of the faith, the Israelites, to go and be likewise. Go take a Sabbath. And so they didn't. And so God ended up commanding them. At first just was like an invitation, but then God commanded it. So in the Jewish faith, Sabbath runs from Friday sundown to Saturday sun up. So earlier in the year, a bunch of us from Woods Chapel went to the Holy Land, and we were in Jerusalem at a hotel on the Sabbath, and we got to experience how in a culture that actually practices Sabbath, how it impacts day-to-day life. So this was my first experience of this compared to our culture. So our guide, Avi, told us to expect the marketplaces and businesses to be busier because everybody was taking part in the day of preparation. That is always Friday in the first century Jewish culture as well as now. And so that might look like going to the grocery store, pre-making meals, cleaning the house, answering all those time-sensitive communications, and figuring out what restorative activities they would want to take part in. So at our hotel, we had a Shabbat elevator, so a Sabbath elevator. So the idea is that you don't even take part in working electronics and machinery. So the Shabbat elevator would stop at every single floor on the way up. And so if you were at the top floor, you got to practice slowing, which we're going to talk about soon. But you wouldn't even press the button on the elevator. And then at breakfast, there wasn't anything cooked. It was all take and run type stuff. It wasn't the elaborate buffet that we had the days before. And then my coffee addiction was out of place on the Sabbath there because their Keurig machine was covered with a cloth because you couldn't even press the I want a cafe latte or anything on it. So that is how it impacted their culture. Taking a Sabbath matters. Our bodies were created for rest and renewal. It's not something that we earn. Rest is a thing in its own. It's an end of its own. It helps us to delight in creation, our lives, and in God. Sabbath happens when we prepare, plan, and that we make it a normal rhythm of our lives. We have no good excuses not to practice Sabbath because God rested, Jesus rested, and so you and I also are invited to rest. Sabbath takes root in our lives when we practice simplicity. Simplicity can be best thought of as minimalism in our present culture. It's not just the design concept of having less stuff in your architecture. But Joshua Becker, a former pastor and now pioneer of the minimalist movement, he stopped ministry because he saw so much of Jesus' practices in minimalism that he wanted to invest in this at the time of his life. And so minimalism is the intentional promotion of the things we most value and the removal of anything that distracts us from it. So I want you to think beyond just our material things. Minimalism is seeing the integration of how our calendars, how much time we invest in various communities and work, and all of that, plus what's in our closets and what's in our garages and what's in our basements. Because it tells us what we value. What we invest our time in is what we value. So Joshua Becker asked us to think about, why do we work? Is it to maintain a certain level of lifestyle? Is it to climb the ladder to establish worth or status? Is it to make a difference in the world? Simplicity or minimalism challenges our point of contentment. At what point do we stop striving for more? Can we find contentment in not having every day scheduled to the full? Can we find contentment in working less? Can we find contentment in owning less? Simplicity invites us to be intentional about every single area of our life. Living into simplicity is about finding margin in our schedules so that we can practice the last practice, slowing. Again, we live in such a fast-paced culture, and we have seen innovation allow us to do things that we could never do before, especially the Industrial Revolution and the technology age has led us to be connected and have access to information that we've never had before. We can get in cars and planes and go from places that we would normally not be able to get to because we would have had to walk there. And after spending time walking for a week, you really get intentional about what you need, because for me, after walking a full 15 miles one day, I didn't want to walk another 30 minutes to go get something from the grocery store. So it makes you intentional about that. So this practice of slowing, it's trying to get rid of that hurriness sickness by taking on different postures and practices of that hurriness. So one of it for work with email, maybe take that full 24 to 48 hours or longer to answer that email. Drive the speed limit or get in that longest line when you go to a store or at a sporting event. Single task, don't multitask. Cook your own food rather than go out to eat, because the efficiency of meals and restaurants and things like that is that now we have all these single-use plastics to take that meal back home, and it's doing harm to our planet. And so think about if we take enough margin that we can cook at home rather than have somebody else cook for us, we remove that from our lives. So this seems like a lot of information, a lot of practices. So I want this to go beyond Sunday. So I invite you to create a rule of life. And this is kind of like taking on a yoke of Jesus Christ, of taking on a practice and a posture and rhythms for your life. So the first example of a Christian rule of life came from the Desert Fathers and a monastic community in Egypt around the 3rd century. And it's been throughout our Christian heritage as something to align our lives to be able to make our decisions about how we interact, what decisions we make, and how we work each and every day. And so Allison Marriott and I collaborated on this week's sermon guide. And so I encourage you to take this off of our website and sit down and intentionally invest some time to figure out how on a daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis that you're able to practice silence and solitude, Sabbath, simplicity, and slowing. Because if we have that rule of life, we're going to have those guidelines, that yoke to keep us with ease and a posture that is different from this hurriness, sickness. And I would love to see any of them that you create. And if you'd love to sit down and figure out more, you need to figure out, what would that look like in your life. I'd love to sit down with you, grab coffee or whatnot. So today, as we conclude, friends, life is too short to work all the time. It's something we all need to be reminded of from time to time. Take on the yoke, the lifestyle of Jesus. Practice that simplicity, that silence, solitude, Sabbath, and slowing. Establish your life around those rhythms. Jesus promises us that our weariness and the burdens that we are carrying will be met with rest, renewal, and rejoicing in the full life. Our hearts will experience that same gentleness of Jesus Christ as we encounter each and every day with new ease and light. Life is too short to not take on the yoke of Jesus Christ.